right, welcome people who are coming into our Zoom room. I'm going to give everyone a little bit of time. It's the wind just rolling in through my house, opening up doors I shut. It's all good. Small little ghost as well. Who doesn't love a friendly ghost? Oh wow, everyone is killing it today being here on time. I'm going to give everyone about one more minute to let some people kind of come in. Feel free to adjust your screens, go to full screens. You can figure out your views, speaker views, other views, whatever you're feeling. The reason why I love to talk through a silence is so you guys can adjust your volumes how you see fit. All right, as you guys get settled, I'm going to roll into my introduction so we do not cut off while you're really here, because we know it's not for me. So, welcome everyone to National Park Service Presents. This is very exciting. We've been doing this program every other Tuesday evening since January. I know January feels like yesterday, but it has been months, if you can believe it. We've been doing it since January, but this is our very, very last one of this series, of the current series. So you guys have come on a wonderful day. Throughout the entire series, we do hope that you have seen the BPL's overall programming theme kind of weaved its way throughout all of the lectures of repairing America, with them mainly focusing on inequality and race and just kind of going back to the stories and history that we thought we knew. And it's really nice to rediscover it. And even though I mentioned that this might be our last one of this current series, it doesn't mean any of us is going away. Please check out the National Park Service summer programs on their website. They are doing amazing things there. And also check back out here for the fall, more like pumpkin weather fall, for when this series is coming back, because you have grown with us. We have grown this series and we discovered that we love it. So we want to keep doing it. So before we go into other rigmarole, I am going to go over some of the Zoom features. We are in a webinar, so it's very exciting and it's easily recorded. So this is recording for you to watch later or share with your friends at another time. It will be on the BPL YouTube page, and it's in its own playlist, so you can actually see past recordings we have done in this series. We currently have the captions on. If you are someone who does not enjoy that, you can look at the bottom of your screen. It's a little box that says CC for closed captioning. So you can click on that and a little menu will pop up and you can click on hide subtitles. And so they'll go away for you. And throughout, you are still welcome. We really, really love your questions. Don't be shy. Go for it. You can click on the chat box at the bottom. Be aware of who you're sending it to, because it says panelists would just be the panelists, and it also says everyone. So if you want to send it to everyone who can read the questions. Your questions might not be answered immediately because we don't want to interrupt Ranger Sean in the middle of his presentation, but the chat will be moderated by Megan Woods. If you remember that name, she gave an amazing presentation a few weeks ago. So she will also be reading through and going through your questions. Towards the end of his presentation, she'll pop back in for questions and go through them. Is there anything I missed? Oh, at the very end, when we say goodbye, your screen will close and a survey will pop up in its place. We really appreciate everyone who's been filling these out. It is so, so helpful. And also it helps us guide into what kind of programs we do for the future, because you don't want to just do what I want to do. I want to do what you guys want to do. So I know I tricked you before, but now this is actually the time. Without further ado, let's welcome Ranger Sean as he's presenting Monuments in Memory, a Confederate Marker in Boston. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that enthusiastic introduction, Karen. Always appreciated.
That's right.
So I did want to start off before we begin by acknowledging the Massachusetts tribe, the tribe of indigenous peoples from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. I would like to pay my respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit historical Massachusetts tribe territories to this day. And with that, I will share my screen and we will get started. All right, everybody. So good evening. Really happy that you took some time out of what is definitely shaping up to be a beautiful night to come and join us for our final lecture series here with the BPL. And what we're going to be exploring today, or tonight, I should say, is the history of two Confederate markers, or in plaques, monuments, memorials, that were actually in Boston Harbor, specifically at Fort Warren on George's Island. Fort Warren was a Civil War era prison where notable Confederates and private soldiers were actually held. So, as a little bit of a backstory, before we kind of knew really anything about the monument that you're looking at on the screen, I am obviously a park ranger working at the National Parks of Boston. And in 2017, I was with Boston African American National Historic Site as the site was coming together with members of Boston National Historical Park to form the social justice team. Now, during this time period, we received a request for more information about this specific marker. For context, this was right around the time that New Orleans had voted to remove some of its prominent Confederate markers, and also around the time of the horrible tragedies in Charlottesville, Virginia, obviously centered around Confederate memorials. So Confederate monuments and markers were something that really had been elevated to a national dialogue and a national discussion. People were interested in them, people wanted to learn more about them, and honestly, kind of to the surprise of all of us, we discovered that this one actually existed. We knew that it was there, but it was something that, had been put up in 1963, and for the most part, except for a blog post from historian Kevin Levine, no one had really been talking about this. We didn't really have much information on it. But as people discovered that this marker existed, and there was a lot of local press interest, naturally, we're in Boston, Massachusetts, and there's a marker that's put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. What's it doing out there? What's the history of it? I was tasked with it, various members of my team to learn more about this. And being tasked with this, I think, was one of the more eye-opening parts of my nearly nine-year career with the Park Service, because I learned a lot about this marker in particular, but I also learned about markers and memorials to the Confederacy as a whole, how they got here, who put them here, and the political and historical climates in which they were erected. And before we dive in to the history of these markers here at Fort Warren, I do want to say that, I'm not here to give you my opinion on whether markers, memorials should be taken down. I think that is very much a, more personal or community-driven decision. What I am simply here to do is to provide context of these markers, talk a little bit about the history of the organizations that put them up, and then I'm very much open to dialogue. But I do want to say that from the beginning here, I am not going to give you my opinion about whether these should be taken down or whether they should remain. So, as I began the research with the team into this particular marker, I actually learned something pretty interesting, that this was not the only marker to the Confederacy that was at Fort Warren. In fact, there was actually a plaque that was put up in 1935. And what you're looking at here are two cutouts of of newspaper clippings from the Boston Globe. And as you can see, it's talking about the Confederate tablet being unveiled, honoring Mason, Slidell, and Stevens. I'll get into those three individuals in a second. But what I wanted to point out here was on the left. And you see that with this article, it says Confederate vet wanted as guest. So in 1935, though they were definitely very old, there were veterans of the Civil War still alive. And as the ceremony is being planned for this particular plaque in 1935, the organizations that are putting this on thought it would be really powerful to have a Confederate veteran and a Union veteran present for this plaque ceremony's unveiling. And at this ceremony, on April 9th, they were able to get a Confederate veteran and a Union veteran. Their names, and I'm just pulling them up right here, was for the Union, they had a man named Charles L. Robinson and a Confederate veteran who fought in the Army of Northern Virginia by the name of William B. Newell. And the idea was to have these two men symbolically shake hands underneath this marker to kind of signify a healing in the nation. Now, the plaque itself is, you can see on the right, and as I said, coming back to these three individuals, it was to honor Mason, Slidell, and Stevens. Now the plaque, as you see here, James Murray Mason and John Slidell. They were two Confederate diplomats who were actually arrested, seized on their way to England in a diplomatic mission to try and get England to join the side of the Confederacy. This was known as the Trent Affair, and ultimately these two individuals who were imprisoned at the very beginning of the war at Fort Warren were released by the Lincoln administration for fear of intervention from Great Britain. Now, the third individual, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, was none other than the vice president of the Confederacy, who was actually imprisoned at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor for about 6 months following the surrender at Appomattox. So these are probably the most well-known prominent prisoners at the fort. And this is a plaque, again, as the globe indicates, to honor these men. So the plaque itself ended up in a room where, as again, you can read by the plaque, it says, in this room, James Murray Mason, John Slidell, and Alexander Stevens, they were all incarcerated. So that room here in 1935. And as you can see, the plaque is over a fireplace. There is a small photograph of Alexander Stevens, and then above it is the Union flag and the Confederate flag crossed. Again, symbols of healing. So you have this Union veteran and this Confederate veteran shaking hands in what was later described as one of the most impressive parts of the ceremony. But within the research of this marker, one thing that we uncovered that I found really powerful, and that my colleague who located it also thought was extremely powerful, was actually a letter that was read here. It was a letter written by none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. It's a short letter, only about 2 paragraphs long. However, a snippet of this letter I think is very telling and really kind of sets the stage for what I'm going to be spending the next 25, 30 minutes talking about. So this letter is read aloud at this ceremony, again by FDR. And a part of the letter reads, "We have heard the last mutterings of the storm that more than 70 years ago swept over this country. The people of our land are now completely united in their devotion to the Republic." So think about that for a second. Last mutterings of the storm. Completely united in their devotion to the Republic. It's a healing narrative. It's a story that speaks to a nation that, again, more than 70 years ago, nearly tore itself apart, but by 1935, in living memory, veterans present from that conflict, the country is completely healed, completely united in their devotion to the Republic. But despite this narrative of healing, despite this narrative of a nation coming together, again, after nearly tearing itself apart, what is very absent from this narrative of the American Civil War is one of the main reasons why it was fought: the institution of slavery. In 1935, segregation, Jim Crow, at its height. But how do you get a narrative of a nation being completely united, devoted to the Republic? How does that come about nearly 70 years after the American Civil War? And how is this something that is very much, within our national dialogue about the American Civil War today? Well, one of the main reasons and one of the things that you get out of the American Civil War immediately emerging that describes this kind of narrative of a nation that is healed is this idea of what historians have coined the lost cause. So the lost cause narrative, according to historian David Blight, who has written a lot about, kind of the reconstruction, the healing of the nation following the American Civil War. He's one of the more prominent Civil War scholars we have today. And, it's this idea that in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, this narrative takes hold where the South, and I'm quoting here, the South had fought with unparalleled courage and consistency. It had submitted to the fates only because its armies had been overwhelmed by superior numbers in force. It's a narrative of public memory, a cult of the fallen soldier, a righteous political cause, defeated only by superior industrial might, and a people forming a collective identity as victims and survivors. When the American Civil War ends, in 1865. There has been unprecedented loss. Nearly 700,000 Americans, North and South, have died. Nothing like that has happened in America up to that point. Not even close. The scope of all that death, how people dealt with that death, there wasn't an example for them really to look back upon in recent American memory that allowed them to figure out a way to cope. And, after kind of doing this research, it's something that I noticed, North and South. So broadly speaking, most towns have Civil War monuments. As I drive around, I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and there's a large portion of the next to our library that was dedicated to the men who died there. And I drive around, and often it's like you see a town square and you see a Civil War soldier, or you see a monument with names on it. And this is not, obviously just in the South. This is very much, in the northern United States. But looking specifically at the lost cause narrative and how this takes hold, the idea again of that collective identity, that righteous political cause defeated. It's a narrative that really, takes shape because in the North, you look at all this death, and though again, you can't, it's hard, you can't justify it, it's tragic, it's horrible, but in the North, people see it as well. We fought a war to maintain union. And ultimately, though, maybe not, definitely not everybody in the North was an abolitionist, this was a war that did end the institution of slavery. But in the South, the Southern Army lost. Slavery ended. So this lost cause narrative is something that I think, and historians have argued, does emerge from the ashes of that death, that loss, in this conflict. It's reason for that loss. 1 out of 5 Southern-born men who were of military age died in the Civil War. How do you justify that? This is one of the ways. So, moving beyond the American Civil War, in the 1870s and 1880s, 90s, again, you begin to see an effort to try and heal the nation. You see a lot of veteran groups gathering together, soldiers coming together, swapping stories, and also having that deep understanding of, what they had seen, the horrors that they had endured. And you see a narrative of the Civil War emerging where, evident in that FDR letter, the nation is healing. It's a narrative of, that brother versus brother, fighting for what they believed in, shared valor. And it's a way to heal. But with that, you do get part of why the war was being fought. Part of that narrative becomes to go away, is lost. And that is the understanding that the Civil War, the main cause of it, was the institution of slavery. And I think a good example of kind of how this narrative takes hold, this idea of, again, shared valor, is here. What you're looking at is a picture from 1913 at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. This was a spectacle that had world news coverage at the time. Woodrow Wilson, who was the president, actually spoke at this. It's estimated that there were over 53,000 veterans in attendance. The federal government paid over $1.75 million to transport any living veteran to Gettysburg. And, this picture here, I think, again, great example of that symbolism. These are Confederate veterans and Union veterans shaking hands where Pickett's charge occurred, which is one of the most famous parts of the Battle of Gettysburg. And, they say a picture says 1,000 words, and here, it's old veterans shaking hands, letting bygones be bygones. But, you look at this picture, you read about the anniversary, and again, what is notably absent is any mention of the institution of slavery, any mention of segregation. This is a narrative of that lost cause. And, I think, as, again, quoting David Blight, sectional reunion could not have been achieved without the resubjugation of many of those people whom the war had freed from centuries of bondage. As we're in the 1890s and early 1900s, Jim Crow laws, segregation, Reconstruction has ended, and these things are a reality. And, simultaneously, as we're moving into the late 1800s, early 1900s, that abolitionist generation, the anti-slavery generation, like many veterans of the Civil War, they are beginning to pass too. And, I think summing this up, as he often well did nearing the very end of his life, actually at I believe it was a Memorial Day speech, Frederick Douglass was talking about kind of the collective memory of the war. And what he said, as you can see here, is whatever else I may forget, I shall never forget the difference between those who fought for liberty and those who fought for slavery. And as we move into the early 20th century, that collective narrative of the nation and the collective memory of the Civil War had really begun to shift. So how does that happen? Who helped shape that narrative? Well, there were several organizations that were involved in kind of shifting and changing, kind of the collective understanding and memories, including Sons of the Confederate Veterans. But the organization I'm going to particularly focus on here is a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, the United Daughters of the Confederacy is an organization that forms in the late 1890s. And it is a group that forms out of another group dedicated to the memory of the Confederacy. This is an organization that, founded in 1894, had, and I have it here, 30 members by World War I. So again, right around the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, they have over 100,000 members. And these are chapters coming from, all over the United States. As you can see here, this is a group meeting in Tacoma, Washington, so obviously very far from Gettysburg or any of the Civil War battles on the Eastern Theater. So this is an organization that really had what was described by historian Karen Cox, who I'm going to quote a couple of times. She wrote a really good book about this organization, as a group that was a very elitist bent. This is an organization that, oftentimes these women are married or connected to prominent legislators, politicians, people who, can get money, can, have influence. And this organization, they were great at fundraising. And they had a very particular goal. Now, according to the United Daughters of the Confederacy's Articles of Incorporation, so think of this as kind of like their founding document, they had three main points that they were focused on, and I'm gonna quote them here. They were to honor the memory of those who served and those who fell in the service of the Confederate States. They were to protect, preserve, and mark the places made historic by Confederate valor. And finally, one of their goals was to collect and preserve the material for a truthful history of the war between the states. And I think that last goal is particularly important, and one that, they really did try to achieve. That truthful history. And again, according to Karen Cox, looking at this idea of that truthful history, the Daughters of the Confederacy, I'm quoting, they regarded their efforts to educate children as their most important work, as they sought to build living monuments who would grow up to defend states' rights and white supremacy. The United Daughters is not only instrumental in erecting monuments throughout the United States. I believe that the Southern Poverty Law Center believes they actually erected over 700 monuments to the Confederacy throughout their history. They're also instrumental in kind of shaping school curriculums. They are giving lesson plans to teachers. They are making suggestions about history books. And they are actually, in some instances, writing their own books. Now, an example of one of these books that was written by one of the historians of the UDC is this book, The Ku Klux Klan or Invisible Empire. This is a book that was actually unanimously voted as a supplementary text for some schools in southern states. And according to the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, in a review of this book, they said they lauded it and said that this is a book that brings the true history of this great organization to the young people of the Southland, our boys and girls of today who will be our citizens of tomorrow. So again, shaping narratives, focusing on education, and also focusing on the public square, creating massive monuments to honor Confederate heroes such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, etc. So this is really what this organization is focused on. But in addition to the textbooks and the monuments, they also had actual groups that were known as Children of Confederate Chapters. And these were groups for boys and girls, 6 to 16 years old. And when they became 16, that was when they were eligible for either the United Daughters of the Confederacy or the Sons of the Confederate Veterans. So they had these organizations which did things like essay contests, working with the daughters at various ceremonies. But at their meetings, at the Children of the Confederate Chapter meetings, they also did something that is referred to as a Confederate Catechism. And a catechism you can kind of think of as like a call and response kind of thing, like something like an adult or a teacher would ask a question, and then the children who would have memorized the answers would all respond in unison. So I do want to share with you an example of a Confederate Catechism that was used in 1929, just to kind of give you an example. So these were some of the questions that were asked, and these were some of the responses that were given. So, for example, think of being 10 or 11 years old, you're in this group, and the adult in the room asks, was slavery the cause of secession or the war? And everyone in the room responds, no, slavery existed prior to the Constitution, and the Union was formed in spite of it. Both from the standpoint of the Constitution and sound statesmanship, it was not slavery, but the vindictive, intemperate, anti-slavery movement that was at the bottom of all the troubles. So this is ingraining this from a young age to, again, shape that narrative and shape a collective understanding of the history of the American Civil War. And, these catechisms, obviously this is from 1929, but these were important throughout the history, and they're still mentioned on the Daughters of the Confederacy website today. And, excuse me, not catechism, catechism. My apologies. Pronunciation, not my strong suit. But I actually went on the Daughters of the Confederacy website today, went to the part of the Children of the Confederacy chapter that's on their website. And this is, again, I did this about 2 hours ago. And they have a section for the catechism. And according to the website from, again, 2 hours ago, it says, and I quote, catechisms are a part of the culture and history of the Children of the Confederacy. Members are encouraged to recite basic beliefs and elements of Confederate history. Children compete at all levels to display excellence. So this is still on their website for the organization that does exist today. And, I think this kind of shaping, this idea that, slavery was not the cause of secession, slavery was not the reason for the American Civil War. This is in direct contradiction to what leaders of the Confederacy were saying when they seceded from the Union. Right here, Alexander Stephens, the man who was imprisoned at Fort Warren in 1860, I believe it was 1860. If it's 1861, I apologize, but he delivers a speech that's known as the Cornerstone Speech. And this is the very speech where he kind of lays out why the Confederacy is seceding from the Union. And as you can see here in this quote, our government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. I think that spells it out pretty clearly right there. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy, again, this is not something that is just limited to the Southern United States. There was a Boston chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy that existed in my research. And again, I need to do more research on this, but they existed as early as I found as like 1914, and they actually existed up until about 2003. And it seems that they were the most active right around World War II. Just to give you an example, this is Observing Flag Day at Faneuil Hall. These are a bunch of different organizations on the stage at Faneuil Hall, and one of the president of the Daughters of the Confederacy was present on the stage, and this is Union Veterans, DAR, so there were a couple different organizations. Here, there was a United Daughters Confederacy luncheon at the Copley Plaza, where they celebrated the anniversary of Robert E. Lee's birthday. And here actually is the United Daughters of the Confederacy giving a portrait of Robert E. Lee to MIT. So, again, that Boston chapter, they very much existed. And they were one of the few organizations that actually funded not only that plaque that was put up in 1935, but also the marker that was put there in 1963. Now, between 1935 and 1963, there's a New York Times article that says that plaque was actually either removed or stolen, so it's no longer at Fort Warren, but the marker was put in 1963 as a part of the bicentennial of the Civil War. Here you have the marker being carved, as well as an article from the Patriot Ledger talking about, what this marker is going to be. Now, the marker that gets put up in 1963 is not honoring the Southern heroes necessarily, that of the Alexander Stephens, James Murray Mason, Jason Flydell. This is a marker that just has the names of the 13 prisoners who actually died at the fort. So it had their 13 names, it had the United Daughters of the Confederacy on it, and that plaque is put up in a ceremony. There weren't any letters read by the president at the time, but according to the Patriot Ledger, I do believe, 280 people attended this ceremony. And according to the Massachusetts pamphlet that was put out about the bicentennial, talking about this ceremony, they said, and I quote, "The Massachusetts chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, with the cooperation of the Civil War Centennial Commission and the Metropolitan District Commission, dedicated marker on Fort Warren, Boston Harbor, in memory of the Confederate prisoners of war who died there during the Civil War. The ceremony took place on May 24th so that assembly delegates from both the North and the South could participate in a spirit of unity." So again, obviously no veterans alive in 1963, but you do have the Northern and Southern delegates, showcasing that unity, or that unity, I guess, out on Fort Warren. So this marker goes up in 1963, and as I said at the very beginning, by and large, it goes up. No one really says anything about it. It's out there and remains kind of out of the public eye, for lack of a better term, up until 2017. In 2017, after Charlottesville, and after, again, the Confederate markers and memorials is something that is very much elevated to that national conscience and national dialogue, the marker itself is boarded up. The marker would remain boarded for the rest of that season. And then in October, it was ordered to be removed. The Baker administration had come out and said, and I quote, "Governor Baker believes we should refrain from the display of symbols, especially in our public parks, that do not support liberty and equality for the people of Massachusetts." He came out in favor of it being removed. It was removed, and it remains in the storage of the Massachusetts State Archives, which is located on the UMass Boston campus. So, kind of before we move to questions, I do want to say that, I think, kind of regardless of opinion here, whether they should stay, whether they should go, I do believe that it is important to understand the history of these markers, understand the history of these organizations who put them in place, and also understand the time period that they were put in place, whether it was the 1930s, 1960s, or kind of more current. And I also do kind of want to share a little bit of a personal story, because I think I've talked about the ideas of the lost cause, the ideas of the Civil War, and our collective memory of it, and I think it's something that we can sit here in Boston and look at and be like, well, these were here, but we would never think this. This is something that this is a Southern belief about the Civil War. Well, I think the lost cause narrative, it's a powerful story. It's a story of an underdog. It's also something that can grab you. It's romanticized, and I think that that's something that's done on purpose. And I bring this up because, for me personally, I grew up and was always fascinated with history, and like a lot of young boys, I was fascinated with military history, and in particular the American Civil War. I've been to the battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, Manassas, Cold Harbor, Appomattox. I've been to a lot of them in Shiloh, and I was very fascinated with the Civil War, again with the military history. And speaking from my own personal experience, I was pretty wrapped up in this narrative. I thought it was fascinating. You know, I mean, it gives you ways to kind of justify the war as a war about states' rights, and, you know, kind of be able to push slavery to the side. And I want to share a picture of something that I actually found in my attic. When I was 16, I was at Gettysburg, and I was, again, really fascinated with military history. And I wanted to get a replica non-firing Civil War pistol. And you can buy them there. You know, it's one of those collector items. And oftentimes they come with plaques. And I had options. I could have chosen, you know, a plaque with George Meade, the Union commander, a plaque with Joshua Chamberlain, the famous Union general, or colonel, I should say, at the time, who fought in the 20th Maine. But I bought this one because it had Robert E. Lee on it. And I bought it because I was fascinated by it. And I bought it because, to me, that narrative had made sense. And, you know, I think that am very fortunate that I get to work with history for a living. You know, I get paid to be able to research these things, dig up old newspaper articles, and try to understand the past and where we came from. And, you know, I think that looking at these things, if I wasn't able to do that, you know, I don't know, because I, you know, did study history beyond high school. And I did that as a choice. You know, that was something obviously I wanted to do, not necessarily knowing that it wasn't going to be the most lucrative field in the world, but, you know, I've always cared and I've always been interested. But, you know, I think that this is something that is important to learn about. It's important to understand where we came from, and it's also important to understand how things that shape our landscape and shape our understanding, how they got there. And I want to end, before we get to questions, actually with a quote that I think comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was writing about the aftermath of the American Civil War. He was writing a history of it, and he's a very prominent, influential early 20th century African-American scholar. And when he was talking about the study in the field of history, he said, if we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego, then we must give up the idea of history as a science and admit frankly that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate the new generation along the way we wish. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and am happy to take any questions. Megan, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, some sort of tech glitch right there. But so the first question that we have is, if the South lost, how do they have so much power in shaping the narrative?
So that's a really good question, right? And I've heard a lot of historians say that the South lost the war, but they won the memory. And I think that you get to see the shaping of a narrative because when you have organizations like the UDC, and when they're coming about and really, Confederate monuments, markers, and stuff, this does happen after the Civil War, but you really see the first infusion of markers and memorials coming in the early 20th century, right around the rising of the second rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, right around the 19 teens. And I think that with Reconstruction, which is taking place right after the American Civil War, you see very powerful radical Republican government being able to take control and pass amendments like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ending slavery, guaranteeing citizenship, and guaranteeing Black men the right to vote. And I think that the backlash to that was so strong, and that it continued, and with the violence that took place in the South, you begin to see people in the North grow tired of the violence, grow tired of Reconstruction, and almost step away. And, you know, by the 1870s, the nation is attempting to kind of move on. It's looking for a way to heal from this conflict. And, you know, I think it was almost easier to, instead of kind of still dealing with the very raw wounds of, you know, ending an institution that was woven into the fabric of the United States economy, a racialized institution. And it was easier to look at this conflict, look at all of this death, look at, you know, the horror and the tragedy that those families, you know, endured, losing sons, fathers, brothers, and say, okay, you know, we passed these amendments. Let's look at the Civil War as, you know, this idea of sacrifice, valor, and in the spirit of unity, that is how we're going to come together. You know, it was almost as if the job was not quite complete. And then moving further away from it, you know, as these monuments are coming, and, you know, as you're going to school and this is what you're learning in school, this is then going to shape, you know, understanding as an adult. And the ideas of Reconstruction as a failure was very prominent in scholarship, you know, in all, not just in Southern scholarship. We're talking like historians from Harvard, Princeton, you know, kind of the elite institutions. They're looking at this era after the Civil War as, you know, Reconstruction didn't really work, and looking at kind of this collective narrative of shared valor, sacrifice, in shaping of our memory of the Civil War.
We have another question. Have you visited memorials in the Deep South, and does the narrative vary there? And if so, how?
So I haven't been to, and this is one of the things I actually do want to do, where I want to go on like kind of a deeper South road trip. I've only really been to Virginia. I've been to Shiloh, so I've been to parts of Tennessee, but I haven't really done any of the more deeper South, like Mississippi, Alabama. And, you know, I mean, I think you look at the Confederate memorials, and I think like good example of that is at Gettysburg, right? There's a massive memorial to the Army of Northern Virginia, right before Pickett's charge, and it is a massive monument where, you know, you look and there's the, you know, Robert E. Lee's at the top of it on his horse. There's soldiers all around him, flags and angels, and it's very powerful, and it does again shape that narrative of elevating these figures to literally larger than life. You know, you go to the Battle of Bull Run, where the most prominent monument at that battlefield is a massive monument to Stonewall Jackson. That is where he got his nickname Stonewall. But, you know, there are cannons, there are plaques, but there's only one soldier, and it's Stonewall Jackson in the middle of a field. You know, again, that narrative of the underdog, I think is very powerful, and, you know, kind of does capture a lot of the people's imagination.
Another question in the chat is, there was also a very strong fascist movement in Boston in the 1930s, associated with the Christian Front mainly. There was a local branch of the KKK in Boston as late as the 1970s. I'm curious if your research showed any relationship between the UDC membership and those of other organizations.
So with looking at Boston in particular, one thing that I have, unfortunately, I haven't been able to get. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy has an archive of magazines that, they released, I think it was monthly. And I think Harvard actually has a collection of them, but they're not digitized, and I haven't been able to get at them because of the pandemic. So unfortunately, I don't have the information that I have on the Daughters in Boston specifically is limited to kind of newspapers and, little things that I can find online. So I don't know anything specifically about Boston connections to, the KKK or other organizations. But I do know that the United Daughters of the Confederacy did have a, strong relationship with the KKK, especially in, kind of the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s, as, evident by that textbook that was written. They, really venerated them and kind of elevated that, along with, at the time, it's like with the popular culture of the film Birth of a Nation, which just comes out, which is considered, one of the first blockbuster movies, which, shines a very positive light on the KKK, which actually was seen as kind of inspiration for the second wave or iteration of the KKK. The UDC is right there, kind of hand in hand with not only erecting these Confederate monuments, but also, kind of glorifying that organization as well. So, I don't know what the ties were like in later years in the 1960s and 70s, but I do know that it was very strong at the beginning of the 20th century.
We have a question specifically about the memorial being taken down. The memorial created in 1963 doesn't seem particularly polemical. Was there a discussion of it that preceded the decision to cover and then ultimately remove it?
So there was a discussion, and I was not there, so I don't want to put any words in anybody's mouth. And I don't know exactly who was making the decisions or choices to cover it up. And then I think because Charlie Baker came out and said, basically that it shouldn't be there, that was one of the main factors and reasons why it was ultimately removed. So, I think that was something that would have been discussed. There are, multiple organizations that are going to be involved that would have been involved in that. But because I was not there and not privy to those conversations, I definitely don't want to, put words in anybody's mouth.
And as you were doing your research, were there any voices you were hoping to uncover? Or were there any people in Boston trying to combat against the lost cause narrative?
Yeah, so I think actually a very prominent voice that speaks out against this narrative is an activist by the name of William Monroe Trotter. He leads a huge protest against Birth of a Nation. There's actually a riot when Birth of a Nation first is shown on the theater at Boston Common. That, it wasn't necessarily like a massive riot, but it was very disrupted because he was there and, trying to protest this. He had meetings with Michael Curley, who was the mayor at the time, to try to get this thing banned. He was an author of a newspaper called the Guardian. So he was a very prominent voice in Boston at the time period, pushing back against, this narrative. For me personally, what I would like to find is, in addition to kind of the pushback against these narratives, I would honestly also like to find more voices of individuals that were involved in the Boston chapter of the UDC, because I would really like to understand, and look at some of the things that they were saying, some of the rhetoric that they were sharing, and, how on a local level, they were kind of contributing to that national conversation about the American Civil War from the United Daughters perspective. So that's something I'm definitely still looking into, and hopeful that if I do get a chance to see some of these, the UDC magazine, that I'll be able to kind of learn a little bit more about that.
And then just for a final question, I'll kind of combine a couple together. Should we care about the valor of the defeated enemy? Do you think commemorating moments of war helpful to America's healing, or hurtful by kicking up all the emotions with it again?
I think that there is definitely something to be said for what someone experiences in war, because that is obviously something that is extremely traumatic. no matter what side you're fighting on. You know, and that is somebody's son, brother, husband, etc. You know, with that being said, you know, there's that individual, there's that family, but there is also kind of the collective of what someone is fighting for. And I think as a whole, you know, you look at those individuals and you look at, you know, that pain is universal, right? But, and I'm not saying that everyone in the Union Army was by any means perfect. You know, obviously there were plenty of individuals in the Union Army that weren't abolitionists. And even if they were abolitionists, they did not, you know, believe in equal rights or equality or civil rights or anything of that nature. But, you know, fundamentally, the Confederacy was fighting, you know, as a whole to break apart the United States in order to maintain the institution of slavery. And it was, you know, with the idea of that states' rights, you know, it was a state's right to keep people enslaved. And again, you know, the North is obviously very involved within the institution of slavery economically, whether that's textile industries right here in New England, you know, accepting a lot of cotton coming up from the South that was obviously harvested by enslaved labor. So I am by no means trying to say that, you know, the North was not complicit within this institution. But I think that you can look at individual soldiers, you can understand the horrors of war, but you can't look at the horrors, just the horrors of war, and remove why that war was being fought completely from the equation. I think all of those factors need to be weighed in, whether you're discussing it, memorializing it, trying to understand it.
Great. So thank you so much, Sean. I think we're going to hand it back over to Karen.
I'm still taking it all in. I'm absolutely fascinated. Uh, that was, I can't even say amazing as I always say amazing. That was beyond amazing. There's so many little notes I was taking. I have so many little things to go and research on my own. This Someone said it best in our chat right now. It's very, very thought provoking. To the point where I also need to go back and do some of my own thinking. Really, really appreciate all of National Parks of Boston being here, everyone joining us on a very, really nice Tuesday evening, and just taking a moment and pondering some history with us. Please also take a look at the National Park Service, their website. They have great, they're continuing programs that are happening. And also, I meant to mention this before, but the Boston Public Library Author Talks and Lecture Facebook page is now up as well. It was hidden for a bit, but we decided we're doing so many amazing virtual programs that we're going to promote them and you can see them always. So please check that out as well. So without a little sad, we're wrapping up, but this is a very happy occasion. We will return again in the fall. So until then, we'll see you then. All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.